Oh, there you go.
There we go. Hi, people on Zoom. Sorry, we were muted. Okay. So the real goal of the book, aside from my personal interest and passion for local history of our area and of the Outer Banks area, it was sense of that local history to include other voices and stories and perspectives. We have so many great stories that are, household names like the Wright Brothers and Blackbeard and all of these great legends and lore and historical events that happened. But as I researched this book and as I kind of formed the idea for it, I just kept learning about all these new people and the accomplishments that they did that I had never heard of before, despite growing up in Dare County and, going from preschool through graduating high school within Dare County. I learned so many things that I had not learned in school. So if I can help to share that with other people, no matter what their age, that would be a huge goal for this book as well. So some inspiration, or people always ask, where did you get the idea, or why did you write about women, or why did you choose these stories? And when I think about it, I have to go back to, I used to work at the First Colony Inn in Nags Head for about 5 years. So if you're familiar with it, it's still in Nags Head between the beach road and the highway. And it's the oldest, I think it's the last surviving kind of Nags Head style hotel on the Outer Banks that's still operating as a hotel. And it was built in 1932 on the ocean front. It was built several miles north of where it is now. And at one point in the late 80s, it was going to be actually the land it was on was purchased by a developer who wanted to clear it, demolish it, and put up beach houses or a condominium complex. Their idea was to just burn the hotel to the ground, but obviously there was some opposition to that. So the town of Nags Head passed an ordinance to prohibit burning historical structures, and that saved it briefly. But then the developer kind of decided, okay, whoever wants this building can have it for $1 if they can move it. So a family, Richard and Camille Lawrence, purchased the hotel, and they actually had some family land. So they were able to move the entire structure several miles to the south, where it still sits today. They actually cut it in 3 pieces, the whole entire hotel in 3 pieces, loaded it on the back of semi trucks, and it was this procession. I think everyone, I was born in 1987, so I do not remember this, but from the photos and the newspaper articles and the memories that I've heard, they did it at night, and they had to move a few power poles, and it was this like parade of 3 pieces of the hotel coming down the beach road, and they reassembled it where it currently stands at milepost 15.5 in Nags Head. And it is still operating as a hotel. I worked there for several years. But what stood out to me was just Camille Lawrence, the woman who had purchased it along with her husband, was so dedicated to this building and so dedicated to preserving it and to preserving the Outer Banks history that was tied to it. She was very hands-on in the running of it, is from what I'm told. So as I would kind of work there and spend time in this historic place, it's on the National Register of Historic Places, I would think about other women who sort of did similar acts of preservation in our area. I would drive back home to Killable Hills and past Jockey's Ridge every time I would, head that way, and think of Carolus de Baum, who was instrumental in saving Jockey's Ridge and getting that turned into a state park. I would think of the lighthouse down south in Hatteras. And as I kind of started just thinking on this topic, it's almost like the stories of women who had been prominent in these different aspects of preserving things on the Outer Banks. It's almost like they came to me more so than I had to seek them out. And the theme that kind of united everyone in the book is their heart for preservation. So preservation of natural wonders, our landmarks, and then our history and heritage. And just to name a few people that are covered in the book, there's Carolista, like we talked about. So she is famous for standing in front of a bulldozer that was in the process of tearing into Jockey's Ridge and developing that. She may have been one of the more well-known names. I had heard of her, I had kind of known that story. But there was other women that I had never heard of before until like I said, their stories just sort of came to me. I actually heard about Cheryl Roberts on one of my favorite podcasts, a podcast that has nothing to do with the Outer Banks, but here's a story coming to that. So she was very instrumental in helping the movement to relocate and save the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse. She's also one of the founding members of the Outer Banks Light Society. And in this photo, she's standing with, that's John Gaskell. So he was the son of the last keeper of the Body Island light, which they're pictured in front of there. So very, very active, absolutely passionate for lighthouses and preserving them. And also she has several books on their history and the history of their descendants. And then preserving our history and heritage, Virginia Tillett was such a prominent member of the community in Dare County. She was an elected official. She served on the school board and the county commissioners for years, but to me, her passion project is for raising awareness and education about the Freedmen's Colony, which again, I had never heard about in all my years of going to school in Dare County. We learned so much about that amazing story. But on Roanoke Island, there was also the Freedmen's Colony, which was a colony for formerly enslaved people that during the Civil War, when the Union occupied Roanoke Island, if they were able to come there and make it to Roanoke Island, they had their freedom. And at one point there was, I believe, normally the population of Roanoke Island at that time was around 500 people, and it actually boomed to over 3,000 during this period. But again, not taught in schools as far as I could remember. So that was really fascinating to research for the book. And today I wanted to tell you a little bit about one of the women in a little more detail. And it's neat because I actually found out about her through the Museum of the Albemarle's exhibit on women in the area and their accomplishments. I had never heard of Irene Tate. Of course, I'd heard about the Wright brothers and their story of the first flight. But to find out about Irene Tate was so fascinating, and probably one of the chapters that I had the most fun with. I was able to find and contact some of her living family and learn a little bit more about her life. So I will share a little bit with you today about that. So in the year 1900, Irene Tate was 3 years old. She was living in Kitty Hawk with her family, pictured here. So you can see her on her father's lap. That's Captain William Tate. And then we have her mother, Addie Tate, seated. And Addie was actually the postmistress. Bill at this time was the assistant postmaster. You can see her sister, Pauline, there on the right. And yeah, there was not much going on in the village of Kitty Hawk at that. As much as everybody knows everybody now in Kitty Hawk, at this point it was tenfold. But Wilbur and Orville Wright, who were living in Dayton, Ohio, were searching for the perfect location in the country to try their flying experiments. And what they were looking for mainly was so they could do that in near secrecy. They were looking for someplace sandy or that would have forgiving landings. And they were looking for someplace extremely windy. So if you've ever set foot on the Outer Banks, you know how windy it is. So Wilbur had written the Weather Bureau asking about these conditions on the Outer Banks. And the man at the Weather Bureau had kind of summoned Bill Tate, Irene's father, to answer that letter. He was well-spoken, well-read. He could kind of compose a letter back to Wilbur. So he did so, saying that basically, yeah, I think it will be the perfect place. And if you do come here, we'll show you hospitality, and my family will open our doors to you. So he never heard from Wilbur after that letter was sent. And then one morning in September, there was a knock on their door, and there was Wilbur standing there. He just showed up. So a bit unexpected. He had a pretty adventurous time getting from Elizabeth City to Kitty Hawk, because of course at this time it was only by boat that you could do so. And he spent about 48 hours trying to find someone with a boat, waiting for the right weather window. He finally arrives in Kitty Hawk at the Tate family's home. And of course, they do welcome him in, just as promised. So Irene was 3 years old at that time. And they actually, during their stay at the Tate family's home, it was just Wilbur. Orville joined him later, but he actually worked to the Tate's family. And I loved this. I found this in an article. It would have been toward the end of Irene's life. It was in 1981 in the Atlantic City Press, and she was just talking about seeing the front yard, and she's quoted saying, "I can distinctly remember I had seen a dead cow as a child walking through the woods with my father. This thing reminded me of something dead, and it terrified me." So I just thought that was funny, that it just illustrates how when you're a child, things can seem so strange and scary if you don't know what they are. But actually the whole town kind of had the same mindset when it came to the Wright brothers and what they were even doing there. They of course thought that, you know, humans were not meant to fly. These guys were crazy. They were very polite, so we're gonna accommodate them. Here's the photo of the Tate family home, which doubled as the post office. You can see in the sign on the photo on the left how it says Kitty Hawk, North Carolina Post Office. So their home doubled as a post office and also as a brief place to stay for Wilbur Wright and a place to assemble his 1900 glider. I thought this was kind of fun too. He had written, the Wright brothers wrote letters prolifically, and he wrote a letter home to his father to describe the house that had, quote, "no carpets at all, very little furniture, no books or pictures, and no plaster on the walls." So it was very rudimentary by Dayton standards, but above average for Kitty Hawk, for sure. I'm sure this would have been a pretty nice place to stay at the time. And then, of course, in 1903 is when the first flight was completed. A little bit about Irene Tate's family. So we have her father, Bill Tate, over there on the left, and that's Irene pictured as an adult standing with him at the first flight boulder, which is at the Wright Brothers National Monument in Kill Devil Hills. And he was a lighthouse keeper. He was involved with the life saving. He was a huge advocate for erecting a monument or memorial for the Wright brothers after what they had accomplished in the area. So he stayed really involved with them and lifelong friends of them throughout his life. And then on the right here, we have a photo of her father and her mother, Addie Tate. And one of my favorite anecdotes from this story is when Wilbur arrived to Kitty Hawk with his 1900 glider, he needed to make some adjustments to the wings. And in doing so, he needed to actually alter the length and the size of the wing fabric that was going to cover them. So he borrowed Addie's sewing machine to make those adjustments and had a little extra fabric. And when they were done with that glider, he told the Tates, you know, we're going back to Ohio, but you guys can use the plane and its materials for anything you'd like, it's yours. So they went and found it where it was, kind of in the sand. And Addie used the wing fabric to sew dresses for her daughters, for Irene and Pauline. So they got to wear dresses made out of what is now a very famous fabric. And her sewing machine, that's actually in the museum at the Wright Brothers Monument too. So that's really neat to be able to see. So to dive into Irene's life and why she is so remarkable, in 1917, so she would have been a teenager at this point, almost 20. She had gone to school for nursing in Norfolk, well-educated, well-known in her community. And at this time, her father, Bill Tate, was working as the lighthouse keeper at the Long Point Lighthouse in Currituck County. And one day a seaplane comes flying overhead, it comes in really low over the Currituck Sound and crashes. He manages to help the pilot and meets Bennett Severn, who's pictured here in the middle. And again, just like with the Wright brothers, he said, you can come to our UN, we'll show you hospitality. So Bennett Severn, seaplane pilot, he was from Atlantic City, New Jersey. He stayed at the Tate's home, just like the Wright brothers did, not that many years before him, but he was flying a plane that would not have existed if they hadn't visited Kitty Hawk. So when he does so, he meets Irene and falls in love. He's so taken with her education and taken with the fact that she has an interest in flight and that she actually knew the Wright brothers and got to witness the birth of flight right in her front yard. So they marry and move up to Brigantine, New Jersey, where they continue to operate seaplanes, and they also have, similar to what we have on the Outer Banks now, they take tourists up in biplanes and planes and fly them over Atlantic City and do sightseeing tours. So all this time that she accompanies her husband Bennett in these flights, she decides that she would like to earn her pilot's license as well. So she logs all the hours and does the work. And she eventually became the first female pilot to fly a round trip from New York to Miami. So she held that record. And just the full circle moment that is, from witnessing the first airplane assembled in your yard to becoming a record-setting pilot herself, to me is just beyond remarkable. At the end of her life, she continued to live in Brigantine area in New Jersey, where they built their home. She kind of brought some aspects of the Outer Banks lifestyle to her home in Brigantine. They had a piece of the cornerstone from the Wright Brothers monument incorporated into their mantelpiece. And then in true Outer Banks fashion of salvaging used objects, she used some items from a shipwreck that had, I think it was an Italian ocean liner, had wrecked up in that area. And she used some of the paneling for her dining room table, and just truly had an Outer Banks home, even though she was up in the New Jersey area. She had one daughter, and then her daughter had 3 daughters who I was able to contact for this book, and who really graciously shared some of those photos with me to publish. And they shared with me just some great stories that toward the end of her life, she'd always sort of been a colorful character, an adventurous and brave character. Toward the end of her life, she had sort of all these animals in her yard, but her baby was a seagull that lived in her kitchen named Squawker. So she cared for this bird. Unfortunately, Bennett had died several years before her, but she had Squawker, and she would send her family out to get him his favorite fish from the supermarket, and just a colorful character throughout her life. In an article from the Atlantic City Press, again, a reporter visited in 1981 when the space shuttle Columbia was launching. And so for her to get to see the first flight unfold in her front yard, and then get to see the first space shuttle launching into space, was just kind of bookended her colorful life. And she was quoted saying the brothers would have enjoyed watching that. And then, of course, years after she passed, she passed in 1984, but more recently in 2020, when the Mars helicopter Ingenuity landed on the surface of Mars, it actually had a little small postage stamp size piece of that wing fabric from the Wright's glider tucked under its solar panel. So that same fabric or similar fabric that she got to wear as a little girl, as a dress made for her, is now also sitting on the surface of Mars. So it's a very romantic story. It's a very remarkable story. And I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about her life today. So that's one of 7 chapters. That covers one of the 7 chapters in the book. But it does profile 7 different women and sort of their impact on our history of the Outer Banks and our local area history. So if you're interested, I would love to hear any questions that you might want to share, or any feedback that you might have. And thank you so much for being here with me today.
Anyone have any questions?
Well, comment and question.
Sure.
Thank you so much for bringing attention to these famous women, because they are inspiring.
Yeah.
And as you look at the big picture, how do you think that we can get this information into the schools?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. So that's almost like part 2 of this. So my initial project was, I would love to write a book. It's been a goal of mine, and this topic is something I'm passionate about, but I didn't really foresee what might come after that. And so far, I've been so lucky to have the opportunity for a few of the different schools in Dare County Public Schools anyway, have asked me to come and sit in with them on their curriculum meetings and on their literacy councils and come and talk to their classrooms. And the administrators and the teachers have really been so great. They've kind of said like, hey, let's put our heads together on this. How can we incorporate all of these things into our local history curriculum? Because I know fourth grade teaches local North Carolina history. And from what they say, they're trying to incorporate even more of that throughout other grade levels as well. So I love to just be able to go and talk to kids and share the stories, but to be invited to kind of sit with them and the teachers and collaborate on how can we incorporate this. That's been really great. And I think they would be very open to other members of the community kind of doing the same. So I know that was one of Virginia Tillett's big goals and wishes, was to get this information and these lesser known stories into our our classrooms.
And I don't know if you were aware, the superintendent of education for North Carolina came recently to Hertford, North Carolina for a dinner. And since it is a statewide curriculum for North Carolina, it might be worth contacting. Have your people talk with
Yeah, I think it's great. I'm not teaching currently, but I'm a licensed teacher as well. So big love for education, and yes, thank you. Yeah. I will say too, just in the research process, it was so interesting in uncovering women's stories. As far as records go, it's very difficult to find, especially the further you go back in time. It's really difficult to find records and primary source documents that even name them by name. Certainly, like I said, the further you go back in time, the cultural context that is at play there. So it was a lot of digging and a lot of work, even census records. As the head of household is typically male, then you kind of get less information about the other people as you go down. So it was it was kind of like a treasure hunt, which I really loved, but I think I underestimated a little bit how really heavy the research would be just because of that barrier. So it is really nice to see how now researching some of our more modern women that I profiled in here, just to see how through time things have changed even in that regard, as far as whose stories get told, whose journals get saved, whose voices get documented. That was a sort of a journey in and of itself through this book. And I actually did come here to the museum to do some of my research, and then the Outer Banks History Center on Roanoke Island was amazing. They have such good archives of all the photos, and I could spend hours and days in there. But during the time that I was writing the book, it was actually during COVID, and my two young kids at home, their childcare was kind of up in the air, so I really had to squeeze it in when I could. But if I had the choice, I would stay in a museum or the history center all day long. Yeah. Yes, sorry.
When Mr. Seven's plane crashed, you happen to know where he was headed?
Yep. Yeah, so when Bennett Severn's plane crashed, he was attempting to fly down to Florida. I have the specific location in the book. He was attempting to fly sort of down the East Coast in the seaplane, and he actually had some of his, colleagues following along in a boat. So they were kind of following through the channels in the intercoastal waterway and kind of following him on his journey down. And then I believe it was an engine bearing burned out. So he kind of had to bring the plane down onto the Currituck Sound. And so it was actually him and his few other members of his party, I guess, that the Tates welcomed in. They ended up continuing on down to Florida, and he thought, I'm gonna hang back. I'm gonna hang on the Outer Banks for a little while and pursue this relationship with Irene. So yes. Yes, yeah.
Are there other women that you found in your research that you wanted to include, weren't able to, or seek better support?
Yes. So she asked if there's other women that I thought about including or want to include, and there are so many. Everyone keeps asking like, when is volume 2? Because what's been really neat is the book's kind of like brought, it's been a good discussion starter. So a lot of people that live on the Outer Banks, or that, their family goes back many generations on the Outer Banks, will say, oh, I have to tell you this story about my grandma, or like, you need to write about this person and this person. So I've learned so much and learned about so many more people since the book has come out, that I would love to write a volume 2 if my publisher would be interested in that, because there really are some, there's just some amazing stories out there. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you all so much for coming. As we mentioned, there'll be a book signing just out in front of the gift shop as well, where the book is available.
Thank you so much.